Star Citizen graphics APIs, we're talking Vulkan. Is it ready for prime time? We are approaching the time, maybe with Planet Tech 5 coming up with 4.11, maybe we're getting to the point where CIG will finally drop DX11 support and be all in on Vulkan. Now, recently we tested this more looking at the CPU side, and I'll show you that in a second. Today, I want to look at what happens when you're quite GPU bottlenecked. So first of all, this is what we saw in the 4.9 performance video. The Vulkan stuff is very interesting. If you look at this graph that we put in the last video, you can see that in 4.7 and 4.8, and basically since Vulkan has been in, there's not really been much overall difference in the average FPS between Vulkan and DX11, the two graphics APIs that are in the game. Remember, CIG are moving away from DX11. At some point, they've said when they're ready, they'll be taking it out of the game completely and everybody will be using Vulkan. But although Vulkan has brought better 1% percentile FPS, less spikiness, less stutters, the average FPS has always kind of been either slightly lower or about the same as DX11. Take a look at this though. 4.9 is the first time where I've measured genuine improvement with Vulkan. It's significantly better at 81 FPS compared to the DX11 73 FPS. And so whatever CIG has been doing in the background, we don't know. They didn't really put anything in the patch notes to explain the work they've been doing on performance. They didn't really mention it at all, I don't think. They seem to have been doing something. So all that testing was testing the CPU. That was at 1080p. The GPU wasn't the bottleneck at all. And really we're seeing CPU, memory bandwidth, how does the game perform? The question though that a few people in the comments asked was, well, what happens when you're GPU bottlenecked? Because Vulkan can be fairly heavy actually when you're GPU bottlenecked. And so here we go with a load of testing looking at that. First of all, the 5080 again at 4K, no upscaling on at all. We have got average FPS, 1% percentile FPS and 0.1% percentile FPS. And the 0.1 percentile FPS is showing like the worst case scenarios, the spikiness. That's like the worst frames, the absolute worst frames, the 0.1 worst frames. And so you can see here that with DX11, it's basically average wise pretty much the same, but we can see what we've always known really when it comes to DX11 and Vulkan. Vulkan is overall generally smoother. So you can see that the 1% percentile FPS and the 0.1% percentile FPS is better on Vulkan. But this test is not completely perfect for what we want to see today, because even at 4K, the 5080 is fast enough that quite a significant chunk of running around Lorville for this result is actually still CPU memory bandwidth bottlenecked. And so this isn't an example of a GPU being completely slammed. So let's now reduce the GPU right down and really make sure it's completely 100% bottlenecked by the GPU. Here is the 3080. And you can see here, well, you might see one thing and think, well, there's a conclusion to make. DX11 is much faster. And that potentially is what's going on. But also what you can't see from this graph is that at medium settings at 4K, the 3080 10 gigabytes, crucially the 10 gigabyte model, is actually running out of VRAM. So we have this whole VRAM demoted thing that we've talked lots about on this channel. And interestingly, DX11 seems to handle this scenario so much better than Vulkan. And so you can see here that again, the 1% percentile FPS and the 0.1% percentile FPS is worse on Vulkan. The whole point behind Vulkan is that the developers have to go in and really kind of manage the memory themselves. DX11 is a much more kind of it just works scenario. And in this case, when you're right on the kind of limits of a 10 gigabyte card's VRAM, DX11 seems to still handle this more cleanly, let's say. And so the Vulkan result is effectively kind of ruined by the fact that we're not seeing the full potential of the graphics card. We're actually just seeing what happens when Vulkan runs out of VRAM here. So we drop the settings again. Those were medium. Let's have a look at some low results. You can see, well, both results, DX11 and Vulkan, have improved, possibly because the graphic settings are lower, so it's not pushing the GPU as hard. But actually still, interestingly, it's still quite close to being bottlenecked. I think it was using like 8.5 gigabytes of VRAM here. So the VRAM is still being slightly demoted going around Lorville. So this was frustrating. I was assuming this test would show what I wanted to show, but it doesn't really. But it does show that Vulkan, under certain circumstances, GPU-wise, isn't currently as good as DX11. But let's now move on to the 9070 XT, an AMD card with 16 gigabytes of VRAM. So VRAM will be out of the equation, but it's not as fast as the 5080. So we should be able to see it 100% bottlenecked by just the GPU. We see DX11's overall average FPS is a fair chunk better. And I think maybe because it's quite high, the average, the 1% percentile FPS is actually doing pretty well. But Vulkan is ahead for 0.1% percentile FPS. So again, those worst case scenario like spikes that are happening are still worse in this case on DX11. But this result does again hint at what I think a lot of people have experienced, that when you're completely GPU bottlenecked, Vulkan still actually is not as efficient almost as DX11. If you are fully hammering the GPU, you are potentially likely to be better off, average-wise at least, on DX11. Whether CIG see this as a problem or not, I mean, we're talking 5 frames, which who's going to notice the difference between 43 and 48 frames? Some people might. Every frame helps in Star Citizen, that's for sure. But whether CIG will just say, well, actually, the frame time graphs, which I'm not going to bother showing here, but we've seen in the past, they are smoother on Vulkan, and therefore overall, even if we've lost a few average FPS, the whole experience is better on Vulkan. Maybe CIG will just say this is better, therefore it's time to get rid of DX11. The question really with this is this going to come in with 411? Are we going to get rid of DX11 for 411? Ali Brown, quite a long time ago now, on a stream I was doing in November, was replying to some questions, and he said this about when DX11 would be removed. He said, if we stick with Vulkan by default for 4.5, so we're talking a long time ago, that wasn't 100% certain at that point, then we'd look to drop DX11 on the following major release, or possibly the one after that. Now, we don't know exactly what he means by major release. I don't think he's necessarily talking about the next patch, so not 4.6, for instance, and obviously nothing changed in 4.6. We've still got Vulkan and DX11 in the game now in 4.9. I think he's probably not thinking in terms of, yeah, the next patch. It's more when we move a load more work across from Squadron to the game that we're all playing, Star Citizen. And so I would suspect with Planet Tech coming, there's a decent chance that we just lose DX11 support completely. Which, again, as we're seeing here, it is a mixed bag. The bigger issue might be that older cards, I recently tested kind of the minimum spec stuff. The RX 560 in that system that I was using, just, I couldn't get working with Vulkan at all. And you do hear reports of this. Older cards, maybe more so, they just don't work with Vulkan, or people who have significant issues with Vulkan getting it working. Can CIG really take out DX11? Are they just going to cut people off from playing the game who Vulkan they just can't get working? It seems quite a risky move from my point of view. I'll be really interested to see. My guess would be that if they can get rid of it, they'll want to. But yeah, if they're getting Spectrum and Reddit posts of people saying, I just can't play the game anymore, I don't know. I mean, the problem with the older AMD cards, it seems to be some sort of clash with easy anti-cheat and the Vulkan driver stuff. So maybe that will get fixed. But for now, that's where we're at with Vulkan. I think it's still highly risky to drop DX11 support based on everything we're seeing here. We'll see what they do.